Welcome to Philosophical Conversations. I'm Sarah Jane Leslie. Fashion and philosophy are not terms that one normally associates with one another. Indeed, in the Phaedo, Socrates and his interlocutors resoundingly deny that a true philosopher would value such things as the possession of smart clothes and shoes and other bodily adornments. A philosopher, they suppose, should be free of such bodily and ephemeral preoccupations, though of course one might personally disagree with them on this matter. But besides the question of whether a true philosopher ought to be concerned with such matters on a personal level, are there any outstanding philosophical questions that arise with regard to fashion? The 18th century philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft deemed the air of fashion to be a badge of slavery. Is there any truth to her claim? Here perhaps the familiar trope of a fashion victim may come to mind, someone who makes decisions about how to dress based solely on the diktats of the fashion industry without regard for how the outfits actually look on them. Such a person, we might say, is a slave to fashion. But just how expansive might this category be? In a recent book entitled Fashion Victim, fashion journalist Michelle Lee writes, "A fashion victim is anyone who has ever looked back at old photos and cringed, a reflex induced by the realization that fashion, at some point in their lives, had been able to manipulate their brainwaves with some sort of ninja control." If one finds oneself looking back at old photos and cringing, does this mean that one is, in fact, a slave to fashion? Professor Rae Langton takes up these questions in an article she recently co-authored with Professor Lauren Ashwell of Bates College. We're joined here today by Dr. Langton, who is Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge and Professorial Fellow of Newnham College. Professor Langton, thanks so much for being here with us today. So we're discussing fashion in this segment, and of course there's both men's and women's fashion, but do you see this as a particularly gendered issue?
Well, clearly there are both men's and women's fashion, and men who love wearing what's fashionable and women who do too. But I think in a culture where it matters much more that women abide by norms of fashion, there is a gendered issue. That's one side to it. Another part to it is that in a culture where the fashions that women need to keep to, if they're to be fashionable, are worse for women than the corresponding fashions are for men, then that's another gendered side to it. But, you know, I haven't thought too hard about this. I thought just a little bit about it, and it was really fun because I was working together with Lauren Ashwell, who knows a lot more about clothes and about fashion than I do. And she, in fact, gave up a career in the fashion industry to become a philosopher.
I did not know that.
Yes.
Well, fashion's something near and dear to my heart also.
Well, I certainly wouldn't have felt at all qualified to write anything on the topic if I hadn't had her help.
Right. So when you mentioned there about maybe women's fashions being worse, are you thinking perhaps in a physical way, the fact that sometimes women's fashions can be physically constraining?
Well, that's right. So we've got, you know, we have this phrase being a slave to fashion or slave of fashion. And a natural interpretation of that idea when you have your feminist glasses on is to say, well, look, I notice that there are these social groups and there are rather different norms about the sorts of clothes that they have to wear. First of all, there are norms that differentiate them really strongly. So that's the first thing that well, clothes in general, and especially fashionable clothes are doing, making far more visible the distinction between men and women, as a rule. But then you notice that what the fashions are tougher for women to live with than the corresponding fashions are for men. I mean, this is nothing. This is so familiar it barely needs drawing attention to. But high fashion for women involves stiletto heels, maybe, stuff that it's really hard to walk in, let alone run or ride a bike or do anything physically active. So there's a literal sense in which fashions for women are hobbling. That doesn't mean that they don't look good. Or at least that doesn't mean that we can't help seeing them as looking good. But the corresponding fashions for men don't hobble them in the same way, at least not at present. I mean, I'm no expert on the history of fashion. Maybe there have been some fashions which hobble men just as badly. I'm just reporting on what I've noticed at present and what Lauren has as well.
But that's actually not the focus that you have in this discussion, not on these physical constraints, but rather on something a bit more subtle.
Yeah, so, slaves to fashion, you might think, okay, first of all, physical bondage. I've got to clomp around in these stiletto heels, which mean I can barely walk. It's on a continuum, admittedly not the same as, but on a continuum with the tradition of foot binding, which was deliberately designed. I don't know if it was designed. Let's leave design out of it. The effect of it was to hobble women's activity. And that's what heels do as well. Then there's the sexualizing of fashion for women. I should have said this earlier in response to why is it gendered. There's a sense in which fashions for women are more strongly sexualized. They involve exposing more of the body. They involve eroticizing certain items. I mean, stiletto heels are far more eroticized than, I don't know, men's brogues for walking in the country, whatever, right? So anyway, but yes, besides the sort of the gendered side to fashion, and besides the physical bonds, if you want to call them that, if you let me call them that, with the shoes and maybe the tight skirts or even just the extremely floaty dresses, which are absolutely adorable, but completely get tangled up in your bicycle spokes when you're riding your bike. So anyway, they hobble motion in a different way. Quite apart from those physical constraints, there are, so imagine someone who is a fashionista, let's say a servile fashionista. So this person I'm thinking of buys every fashion magazine and really, really wants to know what's in and what's out, and spends a huge amount of her income on buying the clothes that are in, and needs to find out from the experts on what's fashionable, what is fashionable. This person I'm calling the servile fashionista because she defers her judgment to the judgment of the fashion experts and then devotes all of her energies to trying to be as fashionable in these terms as she can. That would be a kind of, that would be a kind of moral bondage because, you're abdicating your autonomy, slavishly following this other fashion guru's advice as to what's in and what's out. Mm-hmm. That kind of slavishness doesn't seem great, and it seems to affect women more than men too. So getting back to your question about whether it's gendered. So we've got, physical bonds, the heels, the pencil skirts. We've got moral bonds, the abdication of autonomy as you defer to the judgment of somebody else. But actually, I think it's a bit more subtle than that for most of us. I mean,
because I think most of us, at least none of us, would like to believe that we're servile fashionistas, as you call them. And empirically, that may actually be correct for the majority of people.
Empirically, you think most people are not servile fashionistas? I think I agree with you. I think I agree. There probably exist a few servile fashionistas, and let's feel sorry for them. But most people who like clothes and like fashion like what they see because it looks good to them. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, if they're reading the fashion magazines, it's not because they're desperately wanting to find out, oh, what's the next hot thing? If only Fashion Guru would give me the word about what the next hot thing is before the others, I'd be ahead in the game. No, most people aren't like that. What happens is that the images are so seductively presented, so attractively presented. You see the clothes as gorgeous. So what's in, you like what's in, not because it's in. You like what's fashionable, not because you believe it's fashionable, but because it looks wonderful. So that looking wonderful, where does that come from? Here we have the kind of plasticity of perception that gets shaped in ways that advertisers know a lot about, and I guess it would be nice if epistemologists paid more attention to it. We get that shaping of perception, which means that something looks terrific, and that looking terrific seems to be as manifest a property of it as its colour and so forth, in the way that Hume talked about, and also in the way that Mark Johnston talked about when he talked about the authority of affect, whereby our affective perception of things appears to vindicate our judgment about the thing's value. And that's a fancy way of describing a really, really familiar phenomenon. You know, when something is in fashion, it looks great, and that look is what seems to vindicate our judgment about its greatness. What's so interesting, though, about fashion is that it all changes so fast that you know from the inside how plastic that phenomenology is. Mm-hmm. We know from the inside about how our perceptions get changed over time. That's why I think fashion perception is interesting, because it's a place where we understand how the phenomenological gilding of things, the seeing of things as glowing with this gorgeousness, seems to vindicate our perception of its goodness, and yet it's completely the opposite of whatever had that glow last year or the year before.
So even though it seems to be this objective feature of the clothes themselves, surely these clothes don't gain and lose these features in some objective sense in themselves, as it were, just with the comings and goings of fashion. Rather, it's that our perceptions of them are shaped by the cultural messages that we get through advertising and so on and so forth.
That's right. I mean, nobody, not even fashion experts, would argue that there's some special sort of intrinsic goodness about the look of, I don't know, flares. Right. To take something that's been fashionable and unfashionable and back and forth over the decades, enough that with all of my decades, I can remember what it's like at each of those stages to see how gorgeous they were and how awful they were. What's interesting is that even people who accord that perception of fashion a lot of respect would happily acknowledge the other part of the phenomenology of fashion that we haven't mentioned yet, which is that in retrospect, you think, that was a dreadful mistake. Wearing flares back then, oh, how could I have thought they were good? That's a dreadful mistake. So that feeling that it was a mistake then shows that that's showing that the perception of the fashion now is trying to be absolute, so to speak.
We all know that our perception of which clothes look good varies a great deal over time. All sorts of factors, advertisements, storefront displays, magazine spreads, converge at any given time to shape our opinion of what looks good. As these factors change, so do our fashion judgments. Yet, despite the fact that we are well aware of the time dependence of these judgments, we cannot help but experience them as in some sense absolute. We think that we made a mistake when we judged the clothes of earlier decades to look good. Suppose, though, that we judged in 1985 that Ronald Reagan is president. We do not look back on that now as a mistake. We do not say to ourselves, we were wrong, Barack Obama is president. We understand the judgment to be tensed and time-sensitive. Yet if we reflect on our judgment in 1985 that neon leg warmers look good, we may be inclined to think we were just wrong. What were we thinking? In this way, we treat these judgments as timeless and objective.
Otherwise, you wouldn't be puzzled about it. You would just think, well, just as yesterday it was Christmas Eve, and I thought it was Christmas Eve, and today it's Christmas Day, and I think it's Christmas Day. So, last year I thought flares were great, fine. And this year I think flares are terrible, fine. It doesn't have that kind of indexical element that our other indexical judgments, for instance, about time-related propositions have. They seem to claim a more absolute value, which has got to be an illusion. And the nice thing about it is that we feel it from the inside. So it's a kind of model for other things that we might want to understand about the phenomenology of perception. That's one of the things I find it interesting.
Right. So as I understand it, some of your interest in this work comes in the context of thinking about our autonomy. Could you say a little about how that comes in?
Well, in my work on objectification in general, I've been interested in two sides to the issue of objectification. One side has to do with autonomy and how autonomy can be denied and how that's a bad thing. And the other side of the idea of objectification has to do with projection, has to do with how we gild and stain the world with our passions, as Hume put it.
As we discussed in our
yes,
last
as we
segment.
discussed in the last segment. The issue of fashion is quite interesting for bringing these together as well, because in the perception of clothes, that gorgeousness that we see is this phenomenon of phenomenological gilding. It's the gilding and staining by the passions, which on reflection we can realize is very contingent on all kinds of cultural factors. And yet we feel from the inside the pull of the judgment that it is just intrinsically gorgeous. So for me it's a really nice case study of something that people sometimes feel more resistance about in other contexts, you know, when we're thinking about the value properties that attach to human social groups, and they seem to be intrinsic. That might be just as contingent, even if it doesn't change quite so often as fashion, as the fashion case.
But of course, this phenomenon isn't limited to fashion. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, one's taste in music, which while that maybe doesn't change at the same rate that one's taste in fashion does, that's also arguably subject to all sorts of external influences. People once went to operas for lightweight entertainment, and now that's perceived as something dreadfully heavy, and people turn instead to pop music, say, for lightweight entertainment. So while that may not be a change within the same individual, still a change over time. Yeah. And arguably that's due to cultural influences, the sorts of messages that we get, the ways that the things that we're told that we ought to like. So do you think that this is in any way unique to fashion?
Good. I'm really glad you raised that one. So I don't think it's unique to fashion. One thing that it's more tempting to say about the music case, and then let's think about how that should influence what we want to say about the fashion case. One thing that it's tempting to say about the music case is that a sort of pluralism holds. That is to say, at certain periods in history, the merits and the values of certain sorts of music became really visible. And when you turn your back on it, you're turning your back on something that really has value, and what you're focusing on now also has value. You know, when you switch from Baroque to classical, or from classical to jazz, or whatever, so that the different domains have their value, and that pluralism holds, but there's a sort of difference in the visibility somehow of the value, and that would actually go in harmony with what a number of people say about art, I think, and I think what Marc Johnston has said about the authority of affect, that it really is revealing something of objective value.
And that we might sample from it selectively, so we may at a time only be appreciating one of these objective value properties, and then come, as you say, to turn our back on it. But it doesn't mean that it's coming and going in the object per se.
So, but then the question arises, if we would want to say that about music, namely that it really is, in each case, the revelation of value that differs only in whether it's being made visible or not, then would we want to go back and say that in the fashion case? And in which case we would say it's not just this constantly changing subjective projection that just feels like it's objective. You know, each of these fashion moments are the revelation of something terrific, and it's just that in the passage of time we get blinkered to the ones in the past.
We fail to see what's so wonderful about those flares.
I'm sorry, you're never going to convince me about the stiletto heels. I don't want to be I don't want to end up being a champion for what have got to be the bound feet of our own time.
Suppose, though, that one did want to apply that sort of philosophical model to the fashion case, just as much as the music case.
The objective one.
The objective one, yeah. Would you still maintain that there's a difference between the two that should be recognized on such a model?
The difficulty with the fashion case is that when you think about how problematic in moral and political terms certain fashions have been, in ways where I can't think of any counterpart for music. When I think of, I don't know, a tradition like foot binding, it's incredible to think that, you know, for thousands of years, certain women were crippled, and that crippled look shone with that glow of gorgeousness. They were described as lotus feet. They were, you know, a lotus is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And to describe those crippled feet as lotus feet suggests that they have that special glow. So you can't just say it's this wonderful value that's appearing wherever it goes in the, wherever wherever it exists in the fashion case. But, you know, I haven't sorted this out. It just doesn't seem the same to me. I mean, one thing that you might think is that if we were to think that in the fashion case it is more subjective than in the music case, and I really don't know, I'm really completely out of my depth here, you might at least think that if we're going to be slaves to fashion, and if that kind of phenomenological gilding of what we see is inevitable, maybe it is. Maybe there's better and there's worse, and maybe we can learn somehow to be guided by the better. I'm not quite sure how to go about it there. I do remember that the inventor of bloomers, Katie Stanton, was it? Was rather mournful about the fact that bloomers, this is in the 19th century, namely the big baggy pants that women were very daringly wearing, they were rational but not artistic. So even she couldn't see them as artistic then. Anyway, perhaps there's some hope there.
Our perception of the world around us is shaped in myriad ways by influences such as media portrayals, advertising, and simply the people around us. One arena in which this is especially vivid is that of fashion. In a few short years, we can go from perceiving something to look good to cringing at the mere memory of having worn it. How this should be understood, both metaphysically and morally, is a question that philosophers can look forward to wrestling with in the years to come. Professor Langton, it's been an honor having you with us on Philosophical Conversations. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you.